Okay. Mhm. Hey, Gary. There's the birthday girl. Well, good morning and welcome to the next installment of Exodus. Also, want to say hello to our folks viewing at home, and hope you're enjoying it as much as the rest of us are here. Last week, when we left off, I was talking about Moses, and chapter 2 really is a summary of the first 80 years of his life, and we can only wonder what might have happened during all that time. But the last thing we left was Moses having, probably with good intentions, trying to defend a fellow Israelite, but he ends up murdering an Egyptian and he runs for his life. He flees Egypt, heads to the east, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. In Acts 7:23, Stephen says that Moses was 40 years old when he killed the Egyptian and fled to Midian. Now, we're not told that in Exodus, but we can find other places in the Bible where we find out what Moses' age was. And then later in Acts 7:30, during that same speech of Stephen prior to his murdering, he says that Moses returned to Egypt 40 years later, and then the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So in a sense, Moses' life can be divided into 3 sections, each one 40 years long. And you know what's interesting? You probably noticed this by now. Certain numbers seem to be very prominent in the Bible, and the number 40 is one of them. 40 is very prominent in Scripture, and just based on the context, different people want to tell you different things, but I would say it probably signifies completeness in some way, some kind of spiritual completeness. And it seems like oftentimes 40 is used when there's some kind of a preparation involved, or kind of like getting ready for something. At least that's what my observation seems to be. For example, during the flood of Noah, it rained 40 days and 40 nights. And during the wilderness wanderings, they were eating manna and wandering around for 40 years. Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. The 10 spies that were, or sorry, was it 12 spies, sorry, were sent out to view the land of Canaan, get a preview and kind of see what's going on there. They were gone for 40 days exploring, and because of the bad report that most of them gave, that's why they had to wander for 40 years. Also, you notice that King David and King Solomon both reigned for 40 years. And through the prophet Jonah, the reluctant prophet Jonah, God warned the citizens of Nineveh that they had 40 days to repent. And then 40 also figures in the life of Jesus. Jesus fasted and was tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. So there is something about that number 40. Here's a map I found online. Green is, I'm assuming that's where the core of the control is. The lighter green is where there is maybe some control, maybe not as intense or whatever. But anyway, that's the extent of the Egyptian Empire. And if you take the 1446 BC date that I'm using for this, that from what I've read, that was actually the height of the Egyptian Empire. It had one of its greatest extents. In fact, might have even gone all the way into what we call modern-day Syria and to Mesopotamia. So that maybe adds kind of an interesting twist to the story, is that God, essentially through Moses, God took on the Egyptian empire when it was at the height of its power and wealth and glory. I mean, when it was like the least vulnerable, let's put it that way, when it was the hardest nut to crack. But that's when God decided to do it. I think just to demonstrate that it's his power and that nothing, no kingdom can stand in front of it. But you'll see that they pretty much had either control of the Sinai Peninsula or at least partial control. And so it makes sense when Moses fled why he wouldn't just stop, maybe go 20 miles, 50 miles and just stop, why he felt he had to go all the way to the other side of the Red Sea there and go to the land of Midian, which you see is in northwestern, what is in today northwestern Saudi Arabia. And that becomes real important later on in our story. But he goes to the Midian, and here's another map that I found. We don't know exactly the route that Moses took, but somebody put this map together, and that's maybe one possible route. But the point is that in the northern end of the Red Sea, there's these two gulfs. There's the Gulf of Suez, which is on the west, and the Gulf of Aqaba, which is on the right. And Midian was just on the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba. And that apparently, according to the record, that's where Moses fled to, even though we don't know exactly the same, the exact route that he took. All right. Now that gets us to near the end of the rest of the chapter 2. As I said, Moses fled to Midian, which is in northwestern Arabia. Well, who were the Midianites? The Midianites actually were very, very distant relatives of the Jews. We read the story about him going to the well. There's the priest of Midian who apparently was a monotheist. He had 7 daughters. They were at the well, and there were some shepherds there that were kind of bullies. And, I think they wanted to have first crack at the well because after a while, the water's going to run low, and whoever gets there after everybody else, there may not be as much water, and it may not be as good a quality. So they kind of bullied their way. And here's Moses. He's all by himself and in a strange land, and yet he must be a very courageous person, and it just shows that it just must be that natural tendency that he wants to protect and he wants to serve. I mean, you see it already. And so he apparently defends these girls, and they're able to water their sheep, and they go back to their father, and they tell him the story. He says, well, where's the guy? We need to invite him for dinner to, show some kind of appreciation for what he does. And of course, then one thing leads to another, and it's all very compressed. But Moses ends up marrying one of the daughters, Zipporah, or Zipporah, and I'm not really sure how to pronounce it correctly. He marries her and becomes one of the family and becomes really one of the chief operators for Jethro. Anyway, Jethro was a Midianite. He was a descendant of Abraham through Abraham's wife Keturah. And the Midianites were a nomadic people living in the region east of the Red Sea, which I showed you earlier. As a priest of Midian, Jethro held a significant religious and social position. His relationship with Moses is notable for its cross-cultural and interfaith dimensions. But apparently, he was a monotheist too, in some way. And he also provided guidance and support to Moses, who was leading the Israelites out of Egypt. We'll see later on that he gives wise counsel to Moses. Now, Abraham and Keturah, just to give you a little background how the Midianites came to be, Abraham and Keturah had a son named Midian, hence the name the Midianites. Those were the descendants of Midian through Abraham and Keturah. And Midian had, in turn, 5 sons. This is described in Genesis 25. Midianite traders, you may recall, back in Genesis 37, it was Midianite traders that took Joseph and sold him to Egypt. So there's kind of been a back and forth relationship between the Hebrew people
and the Midianites. Now, in verse 18, we read that Moses' future father-in-law goes by two names. At first, he's introduced as by the name Reuel, and then later by Jethro. And it's possible that one of those may have been a title, like it's possible the name Jethro. Other examples of people that had two names, for example, Abram's name was changed to Abraham. Likewise, his wife Sarai was changed to Sarah. And we have Jacob, who was nicknamed Israel. In the New Testament, we have somebody named Simon, who is much better known by the name of Peter, and also somebody named Levi, who is better known by the name of Matthew. And of course, Saul of Tarsus becomes Paul. And so we see it's not unusual for somebody to have more than one name. Even in our own culture, we know that sometimes when people take on new positions, sometimes they take on a new name. Like I'm thinking about like within the Catholic Church, you have maybe a cardinal from Chicago, for example, who becomes the Pope. And he changes his name. He may have been, maybe his name was Bob or something, but when he becomes Pope, he changes it to like John Paul III or something like that. So it's not unusual to see that. Well, the name Reuel literally means God is friend. And this is the only time that name is mentioned in Exodus. The only other reference to him by this name is in the book of Numbers, where it states that Hobab was the son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, and that's in Numbers 10. The name Jethro means abundance, excellence, or preeminence, which kind of makes some scholars think that perhaps maybe Reuel was his proper name. Jethro may have been a title, perhaps like an honorific title. But he's referred by this name 10 times, all of them in Exodus, between Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 18. So a lot more by this time. Later, he becomes Moses' father-in-law and proves to be a wise counselor to Moses, as I've already said. And then verse 21, we read about his marriage to Zipporah. And then verse 22, the birth of Gershom, which is the older of his two sons. And according to Kaufman's commentary, he said, this preparatory sojourn of Moses in Midian may be compared to that of John the Baptist in the wilderness, like in Luke chapter 1, or that of Paul in Arabia. Moses wasn't quite ready in Egypt to deliver the people, or at least the timing wasn't God's timing. And he spent 40 years in the wilderness. And you wonder, well, if God wanted to deliver the Israelites, why didn't he just do it quicker? Well, if you look at your own life, maybe there are things that you're doing now or things that you've accomplished, but it took some preparation. Like just, for example, professionally, there may be a certain degree or training or a certificate you have to achieve. But in life, sometimes there's certain experiences that we have to go through before we're really ready, before we have the maturity, before we have the insight to do some great task that God has for us to do. And that's what's happening to Moses. And think about it. He's out there for 40 years. He's tending sheep in the wilderness. And it kind of makes me think of when Jesus calls Peter. And here Peter, he's a professional fisherman. He knows every part of that lake. He knows where the fish are. He knows their habits. And Jesus says essentially to him, he says, well, all this time you've been fishing fish. I'm going to make you a fisher of men. And I think what we have here is something similar, where for 40 years Moses had been shepherding sheep. And in a moment we're going to see God's coming to him and he says, I'm going to make you a shepherd of people. So there's a lot of similarities between ruling or governing some unruly sheep and some unruly people. And so I think there's something to be said for that. Also, don't you think that for 40 years Moses is out there? He probably knows, he learned a lot about how to survive in the desert, how to survive when conditions were meager. He probably knew where every rock was, every wadi, every oasis, every mountain. He probably knew that wilderness like the back of his hand. And that's another skill. Moses had a number of skills. He was raised up in Egypt. He knows the Egyptian culture. He knew the language. He had all the wisdom, all the knowledge of the Egyptians. which was helpful in some respect, but then he also has this knowledge of the wilderness where he's going to be leading the people of Israel. So God was unknown to Moses at this time. God was preparing Moses for a great work. And in verses 23 through 25, we have a preview of what's about to happen with the burning bush. Apparently, the time is right to deliver the Hebrews. And in this passage, near the end of chapter 2, we read that God heard, and God remembered, and God saw. And sometimes the emotions, the actions, and even the body parts of men sometimes they're ascribed to God in Scripture. They talk about God as if he were in human form and had human limitations. Sometimes it talks about God coming down to see something, or God remembering his covenant with the Israelites as if he had forgotten about it. And when you read this kind of figure of speech, that's referred to, it's a big word, it's called an anthropomorphism. You might recognize that term, anthropos, meaning man or human. And what God is indicating here is that the time was finally right, or it was about to be right, and he introduces, or this really introduces the calling of Moses in the next chapter, which we're going to get to here. And so in chapter 3, we see that God is ready now after 80 years of preparation. Moses is finally ready. All the pieces are in place to bring about this amazing and wonderful deliverance from God. So in verses 1 through 9, we read the account of the burning bush. And, we'll get to that a little bit. First of all, maybe I'll back up if I can. I think I went too far. Yeah, all right. Well, the place is described as being on the west side of the wilderness at Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And scholars are not quite sure what this is a reference to, but sometimes Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are used interchangeably. It may be that Horeb may refer to like a mountain range, and Mount Sinai may be a specific peak within that range. But at least it is the same general area. They're almost interchangeable. And then verse 2, it mentions the angel of the Lord. And you might compare this with verse 4, where it says that God called to him. And back in the Genesis class, we read a couple of incidences about the angel of the Lord. And many scholars equate the angel of the Lord with a pre-incarnate manifestation of the Lord Jesus Christ. And it kind of makes sense because it's almost like the angel of the Lord and God are like interchangeable. Like in one verse you read about the angel of the Lord, and then it says, well, God said this or that. And so it seems to be one and the same, that it may be Christ. But then in verse 4, he calls Moses, Moses. And when God calls somebody's name twice, that's usually something pretty serious. Double use of a person's name implies special importance. And this was the case with Samuel in 1 Samuel 3. It was also the case of Saul of Tarsus in Acts 9, where if God calls you twice by your name, he's trying to get your attention. In verse 6, we read that God describes himself here as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. References to these three patriarchs, as far as God goes, these are found 9 times in Exodus. So many, many times God refers to himself as the God of these three patriarchs. In verse 8, God tells Moses that eventually he's going to bring the Israelites into land flowing with milk and honey. And this is a colorful metaphor, you might say. It's used 4 times in Exodus, several times, a couple times, like 2 times, I'd say, in chapter 3, chapter 13, chapter 33. Anyway, it's a common metaphor that God uses, meaning a land that's rich in natural resources, a good land with plenty of water and abundance of fruit trees. So that's all it really means. It's not really necessarily going to be milk flowing through the rivers. Also, this same expression, a land flowing with milk and honey, you read it in other Bible books. It's found in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which rounds out the Pentateuch as far as the wilderness wanderings. It's also found in Joshua, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So it's a very common term that's found. In verse 8, also, God makes reference to the land of Canaan, which is populated by the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and maybe some others. And you see similar wording to this 8 times in Exodus. So these phrases come up over and over again. And I want to focus, God reveals himself by the name, when he says who he is, God says, I am that I am. I am who I am, in verse 14. And this is usually described, translated by the phrase Yahweh is typically how it's said in English. So I put 2 verses here because I thought it was interesting. Like I said, over and over again, when you read the New Testament, you see so many references back to Genesis, Exodus, or other events that happened during this time, during the wilderness wanderings. And so I think you get more out of your New Testament reading if you have a pretty good understanding of what happened in the Old Testament. Otherwise, you read these references, and it may not mean a lot to you if you don't really know what it's referring to. A long time ago, I once heard somebody say, the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And I think there's a lot of truth to that there's so many hints in the Old Testament about what's going to happen in the New Testament. But then, when you read the New Testament, there's statements that shed a lot of light on things that maybe weren't clear in the Old Testament, but it sheds light on things that were in the Old Testament. And so I think they go hand in hand. But I had these 2 verses here one is from Mark and the other is from Luke. And you can see, I highlighted in white the fact that Jesus himself, our Lord, is making a reference to the book of Moses, in this case Exodus. He doesn't say the book of Exodus, but he says the book of Moses. And he makes a reference to the burning bush. So if you ever wondered, like, well, that's probably just a myth or a legend or something, I mean, Jesus is affirming the historicity of this, that this is an actual event that really happened. And I think it's kind of funny, if some people are skeptical about miracles, they say, well, this could never happen, or this is not normal, this is not natural law. And my response is, well, I think that's why they call it a miracle, right? That's why they call it a miracle, because it's not natural, because it doesn't normally happen. But anyway, it just shows the ties between the New Testament and the Old Testament. And, well, I went a little too far here, but okay. So God gives him a mission. In verse 10, he says, I want you to return to Egypt and go to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. And as you probably know, Moses gave a number of excuses. His first excuse is, who am I? Some are chosen not because of who they are, but because of what they can become. Moses didn't feel himself worthy. Like, I'm just a shepherd now. I'm kind of a nobody, and I'm way over here. I'm far away. But think about not only Moses, but people like Gideon, who was chosen for a special job. Or think of Jonah. Jonah was definitely reluctant to do the job that God assigned him. Saul, who would you pick to be the greatest Christian missionary in the world? You probably would not normally recruit him from somebody who persecutes Christians and puts them to death. That's probably not the first person on your job search, right, when you're trying to find somebody to fill that role. Also, I remember, I think it was King Saul, when he was anointed king, I think he said, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, we're the smallest tribe, why would you pick me? You think about the birth of Jesus. Just recently, much of the world marked the birth of Jesus, even though we don't know exactly when, but typically we use this time of year to mark that. If you're bringing the king of the world or king of the universe into this world, and he's the Son of God, you'd think, from a human perspective, you'd think I'd have a big PR campaign. We're going to get all, the best medical personnel and the best facilities. And God, he turned the script totally upside down. and does things in such a humble way, but he does things like this to show that the success does not depend upon our lineage or our birth or our qualifications at all. So Moses is saying, hey, I'm really not qualified. And then God just chooses unlikely people. And then there's some remaining excuses. In 3:13, he says something to the fact, well, I'm not really knowledgeable. I don't really know enough about you. He says, well, look, I'm going to be going to the sons of God, and when I go to them, they're going to, I'm going to say, well, the God of your fathers sent me. And they're going to say, well, what's his name? What shall I say to them? And it's we're not quite sure exactly what Moses was getting there, but it kind of sounds like they're going to be skeptical, like, who is this God? And is it really the same God that spoke to our forefathers? And do you really know anything about him? And then in moving on to chapter 4:1, he says, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. And so he says, they probably won't believe me. So he's giving all these excuses why he wouldn't go. You need to send somebody who they know, because think about it, nobody there knew Moses, maybe his immediate family, but there are very few people after 40 years that would still be around that would even know who Moses is. And in 4:10, he says, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. So he really gets hard on himself, saying, I'm not a good speaker. Although, if you look at what Stephen says about him, Stephen says he was powerful in speech. So Moses, maybe he wasn't the best speaker, or maybe he didn't think he was a good speaker. Maybe, too, he was maybe making it sound worse than he really was because he really didn't want the job. So he's saying, I'm really not that good. You probably need somebody who's a little bit more eloquent than me. And then I think God, God replies, well, who is it that gave man the ability to speak? I can work with you. And then in verse 13, Moses says, I'm sorry, I need to move on here. Okay, the last one. Moses says, send the message by whomever you will. In other words, why don't you send somebody else? Really, just anybody else, just not me, okay? Moses really did not want his life disrupted. And I think there's probably a number of reasons. First of all, he was probably in a routine. After 40 years, he's kind of settled. He's 80 years old. He's settled. He's in his routine. He's kind of comfortable with life. He's kind of got things are predictable. Maybe you can relate to that. Sometimes, I'll just give you a crazy example. Let's say somebody asks you to go on a mission trip, but you're getting a little older, and you say, well, I'm just kind of comfortable. I've never been outside Oklahoma, and I just don't really want to do that. And sometimes we just have to push ourselves to do things. I can tell you many times in my life, there was some event, not necessarily a religious event, but just something I had to go to, and I really didn't want to. I was maybe in my pajamas or something, and I'm real comfortable. I'm watching TV, but I go, well, yeah, maybe I'll go ahead and go anyway, or I push myself to it. And usually when I go, I'm glad I did, because I end up maybe meeting somebody interesting, or I learned something, maybe end up having a good time. But I was kind of hesitant to go in the first place. Maybe that's happened to you. So I think he didn't want his life disrupted. And also, I'll bet that he was a little bit intimidated about the thought of going back to Egypt, where he hadn't been in 40 years, and actually appearing before the most powerful man on earth at that time was Pharaoh. Egypt was the most powerful country in the world, and that's tough. So I have on the next slide here, I've got a list of things. I thought it'd be worth looking at why this task seems so daunting. Try to put yourself in Moses' shoes. From our human perspective, what God was asking of Moses was really the impossible. And I think if we think about this a little bit, I think we'll appreciate the story that much more, because it's easy to read something and kind of gloss over, but if you really think about the context of what was going on then and there, I think you get more out of it. First of all, Moses was a lone man. He had no army. He didn't have a band of supporters that could back him up and go with him. He was not powerful. He was not wealthy, at least not wealthy like the Pharaoh was. He didn't have influential people to back him up. He didn't have a dedicated staff or followers. It was just pretty much him. That was it. Also, at this time in history, I already mentioned, Egypt was really at the height of its power. It was already the most powerful nation, but it was really at the zenith of its power. Had the greatest extent of its territory. It controlled Canaan and all the way into Mesopotamia. So if you were a skeptic, and Moses tells you about his conversation with God, you might say something like this. You might say, now let me get this straight. You're just going to waltz in there all by yourself and tell the most powerful man in the world to let millions of his workforce leave the country permanently? Really? You're going to try to do this? I mean, think about it. From our human perspective, that's how we would see it. Also, he was no longer living the privileged life of a prince of Egypt. He didn't have all the power and influence and friends in high places. He was now a simple shepherd living in a distant land. How can he dare demand anything from the king of Egypt? What in the world could he offer the king of Egypt, or how could he threaten him in any way? Also, he'd been out of circulation for 40 years. Can you imagine, if you've moved around in your life, can you imagine going back to a place that you haven't lived in since 1985? That's 40 years ago. Imagine going back to a place you hadn't lived since 1985, and all your friends, anybody you knew, has either moved away or passed away, or they've forgotten you. So he had almost no connections in Egypt, almost none. There were a few people still alive who would remember him. A lot of them wouldn't know who he was. Also, think about, what about last time he went to Egypt? How did that work out? How was that? Well, last time he was in Egypt, he was running for his life because he was wanted for murder. And now you want to go back? You were a fugitive for the past 40 years. Now you want to go back. Also, the last time when he tried to help his fellow Israelites, instead of expressing gratitude and appreciation and welcoming him, they rejected him. They didn't really appreciate it at all. So that didn't go too well. Also, here he's commissioned to lead some 2 million slaves out of bondage, depriving their masters of the benefits to them. That was economic benefit, plus one of the reasons the Egyptians kept them down was they were a bit of a national security threat. So we got all these slaves out here. They're getting bigger and bigger every year. They keep growing. And if they unite with our enemies, this could be a real problem because they're right here on our territory, in our land. So also, okay, suppose he does deliver these slaves. Suppose he goes from shepherding a few sheep, now he's in charge of 2 million people. Then what? What does he do with them? Where does he go? How does he provide for them? He had to lead all these people through the wilderness. Had to lead them through the wilderness to a land that had been occupied by other nations for centuries. In other words, there were already people in Canaan. It's not like it was just open and they could just walk in, no trouble. There were already people there, living in fortified cities. And those people were currently under the protection of the Egyptian government. And they had to go in there and displace them. This is not an army. This is just slaves of men, women, children. And so I think you can see from a human perspective, it's really a very difficult task. In the verse 16, Moses is told to gather the elders of Israel together. And this would have been the most appropriate way to contact the people at large. You start with the people who are in the leadership. And by the way, this is the first time that this organizational structure is mentioned in the Bible. The fact that they had these elders or senior people representing different tribes or different clans, and that's who you go through. All right, well, now, that gets us now to chapter 4, the actual return to Egypt. And Moses is given various signs. Moses, partly, Moses is one to say, well, when I go there, how are they going to believe me? Why would they trust me? And then, not only that, but Moses himself he probably had some trepidation about what he was about to do. So he wanted to be reassured. So there was kind of a double-sided version of this, or reason behind it. Well, first of all, in the first 13 verses, we read about the 3 signs that are given to Moses. Number 1 is the staff that becomes a serpent and then back again. So he lays the staff on the ground, becomes a serpent, and then Moses is scared. He doesn't even want to touch the thing. That's how real it looks. And God just says, no, just take it by the tail. It'll be all right. And it does. And then number 2 is the leper's hand returned to normal. He says, put your hand in your chest, take it out, it becomes leprous, all white and nasty looking, and then he puts it back in, and it comes out fresh, just like baby skin. So, now interesting enough, there's no record of this being performed afterward, although later on we do read that Moses did perform various signs for the elders, and they believed. And so it's assumed that he probably did that. So perhaps this was a sign to convince the Israelites, maybe just to bolster Moses' faith. And the third one is, he talks about the Nile water being turned to blood, and Moses takes some water, pours it on the ground, and it turns into blood. So those are the 3 signs. And while all this is going on, unknown to Moses, Aaron is on the way. His brother Aaron, who I assume he has not seen him in 40 years. And so God must have messaged Aaron in some way to tell him to start heading to the land of Midian. And in verse 14 through 17, God tells Moses that Aaron will be the speaker for Moses. So they really work together as a team, that God typically would tell Moses something, but then Aaron would often be the person to either speak it or to act it out. And then in verse 27, 28, we read that Moses and Aaron meet at the mountain of God, which of course is Mount Sinai. All right. And then Moses and his family set out for Egypt. Out of consideration for his father-in-law and his family, he goes back to Jethro and he says farewell, and Jethro gives him the permission to leave and gives him his blessings. And then at this time, Moses has 2 sons. Zipporah and the 2 sons depart. And this time, in this chapter, and also some in the previous chapter, God had given Moses predictions of the ultimate outcome. There's still a long road ahead, many things that had to happen, but God is giving him a preview of this is what's going to end up happening when it's all said and done. In chapter 4, verses 21 through 23, God predicts the death of the firstborn and the Passover, which happens in chapter 12, and you could read the fullness here on the slide. And then earlier in chapter 3, verses 21 through 22, God told Moses that when they do leave Egypt, they're going to be leaving rich, that the Egyptians are going to bestow them with things. And you may recall, I think I said this last week, that even way back in Genesis 15, God told Abraham that his descendants would be slaves in a foreign land, but he tells Abraham that when they finally do come out, that they're going to come out with a lot of wealth, a lot of possessions. And so it's a mystery about how is that all going to unfold? How is that going to happen? So God already has this all planned. He already knows what's going to happen here. Now, this gets us to a puzzling event that I'm going to spend a little time on. It's not that it's that important, I don't think. It's just that people aren't really sure what this is all about. In verses 24 through 26, we read about the circumcision of one of Moses' sons. We're not told which one. It's interesting because when I read commentaries, some people say it's Gershom, some people say it's Eleazar, but we don't really know. But it says in verse 24, a very curious thing. It says that the Lord met Moses and sought to put him to death. This incident is one of the most enigmatic events recorded in the Bible. Because when I read this, at least from my perspective, I'm thinking God went to great lengths to recruit Moses and to convince Moses that with constant excuses, God kept trying to convince Moses that he needed to do this. And he even gave him the 3 signs. And here Moses is already on the way to Egypt. And after all that, why would God now try to kill Moses? And so that's what I'm hoping I can explain. And again, one thing you got to remind yourself is that this is a condensed story. There's a lot of background detail we're not given. We're just told kind of the facts, but we're not really told the background. And so that's one thing to keep in mind when you look at puzzling passages like this. Also, what I tell myself when I read something that puzzles me or I just don't understand about why God did something, I just tell myself that the good things that I do know about God, that I do understand about God, overrides the few things that I don't understand. So the good that I know overrides the things that I don't understand. And so I figure God can see way beyond what I can see. He's a lot smarter, more powerful than I am. So if he does something, he's got a good reason for it. So the 2 main issues here is how exactly did God seek to kill Moses, and why did God seek to kill Moses? Now we got about 4 minutes left. I'm hoping I get through this before we close, because it's going to be a little bit lengthy to explain this. First of all, the how. Let's cover that first. First of all, I'll tell you what it does not mean. It does not mean that God tried to kill Moses, but so far had failed to do so. I hope we all understand that. If God wanted to put somebody to death, there's nothing that can stop that. God has control over life and death. So that's not what it's talking about. But it does seem to be some sort of a warning that Moses was in danger of being punished for something, and that unless he repented or remedied the situation, then he would be put to death. So maybe in some kind of warning. Well, there's several ways that such a threat of death could have been conveyed to Moses. One example might be something like a death angel, such as the one that appeared to Balaam in Numbers 22, that there may have been an angel with a sword or something that maybe stopped Moses on the way and sent Moses the message that something needed to be done different. Or it may have been a life-threatening illness. Quite a few commentators that I've read seem to think that perhaps he had a life-threatening illness that Moses interpreted as some kind of a judgment on him, that Moses had done something wrong, and so God gave him this illness to get his attention. Or perhaps God simply spoke to him similar to what he did at the burning bush and warned him verbally that he was in danger of death if he didn't turn things around. So that's some possible explanations of how God sought to put him to death. And then the why. Well, I think in the context, it seems to be pretty clear that it's tied to Moses' failure to circumcise one of his sons. According to the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17, all of Abraham's male descendants were to be circumcised as a sign of their covenant with God. And it doesn't necessarily say just the Hebrews. It doesn't say they're just the descendants of Isaac or Jacob. So I'm assuming all of Abraham's descendants, and that would include the Midianites because they too were descended from Abraham. And now think about Moses was on his way to be the leader of the Hebrew people, and yet his own son had not received the sign of the covenant. In Genesis 17:14, when God is talking to Abraham about this, God told Abraham that any uncircumcised male shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And then my question is, what about the timing? Like I thought, why did God tell Moses this at the burning bush? Why didn't God tell Moses this when he was getting ready to leave Egypt? Why does he wait till he's like halfway there to threaten Moses with this? We're not told. But I'm going to speculate a little bit. I think possibly it may be that God was giving Moses time to realize the need on his own. Perhaps back at the burning bush, when God called Moses for this job, maybe God was, kind of put in human terms, maybe hoping that Moses would realize on his own, like, well, you know, man, if I'm going to be going to Egypt and trying to lead these people, then I better get my family in order and circumcise my sons. And maybe when he left for Egypt, God was saying, come on, Moses, you know, I'm kind of hoping you get on board here. And maybe God's patience ran out and said, well, obviously Moses isn't getting it. Moses hasn't figured this out yet. And so maybe that's what's going on. And then when you look at verses 25 and 26, Zipporah, for whatever reason, actually performs the circumcision. Maybe Moses wasn't healthy or who knows what. But anyway, realizing the urgency of the situation, she acted quickly and circumcised her son, their son herself, thereby averting disaster. She threw the foreskin at Moses' feet and says, you are a groom of blood to me. It's pretty obvious in the context. She's really angry about this. And a lot of commentators seem to think that she probably found the whole rite of circumcision very distasteful and didn't like it, and perhaps that's the reason that one or both of his sons had not been circumcised, that Moses gave in to that, maybe did not insist on them being circumcised because she found it so distasteful, but maybe to save her husband's life, she goes ahead and does this on her own, but she's kind of, seems to be, she resents it, she's angry about it, and it's like, ugh, you know, I'm really don't like this whole bloody affair at all. Well, anyway, it appears that after this incident also that Zipporah and the two boys did not continue to Egypt with Moses. And we know this a little just by a little bit of inference. Two reasons. First of all, after this incident, Zipporah and the two boys are never mentioned again throughout the whole time that Moses is in Egypt until the Israelites had crossed the Red Sea and camped at Mount Sinai. So they are totally absent from the Bible record. Also, kind of along with that, when Jethro hears of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt and the Red Sea, and they're out there by the mountain, he goes to visit Moses in the wilderness, and we're told that he brings Zipporah and their two sons with him. So obviously at that time, they were not with Moses. So maybe this whole affair, either he thought maybe just too much trouble to bring them, or she didn't want to go any further, whatever. But apparently, at some point, they went back to Midian and didn't come back until maybe a year or so later when they finally ride to the mountain. All right, thanks. We're going to have to stop here for the day, and thank you so much for coming this morning, and we'll see you next Sunday.